the recording. Okay.
Okay, so let me share my screen and then I'll get started. And whilst I'm presenting, please ask questions. If you have a question, please make a noise because I'm not looking at Teams while I'm presenting. So if you just make a noise, say something and I'll stop talking and then you can ask a question. But I'm going to just show you some slides to actually explain the product and explain the architecture, and I'll actually show you a demo as well so you can see the product working for both thick client and browser-based authentication. So this is me. We've done the introductions, we've discussed your requirements before we started the recording. So I'm going to give you an overview of the Trust Broker architecture and a demo, and then we can have more questions at the end if needed. So this is just a slide showing some of the customers who are using the Trust Broker product. As I explained, within CyberSafe, we were developing and selling the products to customers all over the world for over 20 years. A lot of these, the reason why I show this slide is because it's worth pointing out that some of the customers actually use the product differently. The product is very flexible. Some companies bought the product because they wanted single sign-on. Some companies had a multi-factor authentication need. Some companies bought it for single sign-on and then started using MFA for selected users. I remember you mentioning that you've got some systems that have got sensitive data in them. You could perhaps use Trust Broker so that you get multi-factor authentication to protect the sensitive data. And we'll come on to that in a bit more detail when I go further into the presentation. But one of the companies here, Sony Pictures, they bought the product because they had a data breach. And obviously, it's the wrong way around. You should actually buy the product to avoid a data breach, not after you've had the data breach. And for example, PowerGrid, they bought the product because they had customers who were logging into their portal over the internet, and they wanted multi-factor authentication for those users. So different companies buy the product for different reasons. And today we're going to be showing you the product for SAP GUI and also accessing Fiori-based applications or other applications via a web browser. So I'll show you both of those different logon methods because that sounds like the primary use within your company. Okay, so to start with, we'll talk about the architecture of the product. So just to set a baseline, let's talk about single sign-on. Single sign-on is where the user logs into their workstation. It could be a Windows, it could be a Mac, and they are authenticating. Now, in your case, I assume that you're logging in with Active Directory domain or an Enter ID credentials, probably an Active Directory domain. Is that right?
Yeah, Active Directory.
Yeah. So you're logging in with an Active Directory domain, username and password, and you're getting authenticated to the Windows desktop. And when you do that, Active Directory is issuing you a Kerberos ticket. That's something that you don't really need to know about, but some people who are more technical understand that Active Directory is issuing a Kerberos ticket, and that Kerberos ticket gives single sign-on. So when you log into your SAP applications, that Kerberos ticket can be used to authenticate you to the SAP system. So you're authenticating twice effectively. You're authenticating when you log into Windows, and you're authenticating when you log into each of the SAP systems. And that gives the single sign-on environment. So from what you've explained before, this is kind of what you're getting at the moment. You're logging in to your SAP systems and you're getting SSO across your SAP GUI login requirements for your users. So just the concept of SSO is quite obvious, and obviously you're familiar with this. Then we start to talk about multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is used for lots of different reasons. These are the main reasons that I've summarized. Firstly, to avoid a data breach, because if somebody's password is stolen, that password can be used to log in as that user, and nobody would be potentially be aware of whether it was the real user or somebody who's actually stolen that user's password. Because if a user has got certain authorizations, if I log on as that user instead of the real user logging on as that user, then nobody will know that it's actually not me. SecurityBridge helps with that a little bit, as you know, the SecurityBridge platform product, but the point I'm trying to make here is that credential theft is important to be aware of, and it's a risk. Most of the data breaches that happen are caused by credential issues. If you look at a lot of the reports and statistics on the market, especially the Verizon data breach report, it shows that year on year, the number of breaches that happen that are to do with credentials actually is increasing. It's in the high 90s, basically 90%. Now, MFA is also used for regulatory compliance, and in different industries, compliance is becoming more and more important. And in fact, a lot of the compliance initiatives, GDPR is just one of many. MFA started off being recommended or strongly recommended or optional, but now we're seeing in the market there's a few compliance initiatives that are widely used across different industry sectors that are actually saying now, effective this year, MFA is mandatory. So you will see more and more pressure from regulatory bodies and directives to actually make sure that you use MFA for your critical data and your SAP systems. At the moment, you're not doing that because you're logging into your SAP systems using single sign-on, so there's no MFA. The last point here is actually quite interesting. Hackers don't break in their login. Basically, it means that a hacker is going to go after your password. We've actually been lucky enough to hear a presentation from somebody who spends his time on the dark web pretending to be a hacker. And there's probably quite a few people in the world who do that in order to get some insight into how these hackers work. And we've seen real data on the dark web, which actually shows people in companies offering to sell credentials. Like somebody could say, I'm an administrator in company XYZ, and I have admin access to our SAP systems, and I can sell this to you and help you get into our systems over the network if you pay me X, because I'm in debt and I need lots of money to pay off my debt. This is the kind of thing that happens. It's real life stuff. We've actually seen live posts on dark web forums where it actually says this, and it makes you really see that this is not something that happens in science fiction movies. It's actually a real thing, and it does happen on a regular basis, and this is what causes a lot of the breaches. In fact, some people are suggesting that part of the Jaguar Land Rover breach was to do with credentials, not necessarily the only thing that happened, because it was also involving a patch that didn't get installed, but part of it might have been to do with credentials as well, because they had to somehow get into the system in order to exploit the vulnerability. So lots of reasons for MFA. So question now we have is, we've started off with single sign-on like you have at the moment. How do we actually take that forward and implement MFA in your SAP environment? Now, this is one way of doing it. This is actually the way that SAP's latest product does it. SAP have a product which you could potentially upgrade to from your existing SAP single sign-on product. The SAP single sign-on version 3 product, which I think you're using, might be wrong, but I think you're using the SAP single sign-on 3.0 product, which goes end of life next year. If you contacted SAP, they would encourage you or suggest to you that you buy their SAP Secure Login Service product. That's their latest product that they released a couple of years ago. We don't want you to do that. We want you to go to our product as well, and I'm hopefully during this presentation and demo going to make you understand why, so you can understand the differences. But anyway, this is the architecture that SAP latest product works, how SAP's latest product works if you want to introduce MFA to your SAP GUI users. Now, in these diagrams, I'm using Microsoft as an MFA provider, but I understand your standard MFA is to use Ping ID. So just replace the Microsoft logo with the Ping ID logo. The same would apply. So what would effectively happen?
No, it would, so for the for web applications and also Fiori, we use Ping Federate as an summer single sign-on solution. For the multi-factor, we also have in place, we use one login.
Okay. I don't understand why, when you've got the Ping Federate to use, but you could use either.
Enterprise architect decisions.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you've got both, I guess, means you can choose which one you want. Maybe at some point they will standardize and have one product, but we can support them all. So the architecture here is designed this way so that you can have MFA, and it works such that you log on to the first system after you've logged into Windows and you get an MFA challenge. And in fact, this is actually the same way that SAML works. If you log onto your workstation and then you log into Fiori, for example, you're going to get an MFA challenge. But if you then log out of Fiori and you log into something else, and then later in the day, let's say 3, 4, 5 hours later, you log into Fiori again, are you going to get an MFA challenge? Probably not, because you did that earlier in the morning. And that's one of the issues and it's the issue with the SAP product, because let's suppose that log on in the morning after you've logged into Windows is actually a login to a very low importance SAP system. It could be, for example, you're entering timesheet data or looking at your timesheet. So you log into a system that's not really that important. It doesn't contain any confidential information, no sensitive data, nothing that needs to be protected, and you're going to get an MFA challenge. Very confusing for the user to start with, because the user's thinking, why did I need to do MFA when I'm just looking at my timesheet? That seems a bit weird. Users are actually getting quite clever. They actually understand why MFA is needed because they're using it in their personal life. When a user logs into their bank, they're getting MFA, and that makes sense. It's logical. People understand why MFA is used when they log into their bank. But if they're logging into a system and they're not doing anything important or looking at anything important, and they get an MFA challenge, it's a bit confusing for them. So what typically happens is they get their MFA challenge, and then 3, 4, 5 hours later, they log into a different system, and that system's the most critical system in the company. It's got all the confidential data in it. It's locked down. It's got everything in there that the company wants to protect, and there's no MFA. Is that the right thing to do? Clearly not. But that's the way it works. This is how SAML works. This is how the SAP Secure Login Service product works. This is basically what we're trying to get you to understand here. So when we use TrustBroker, this is how TrustBroker works. TrustBroker is different. TrustBroker can work this way as well if you want it to, but it's not recommended because it's not ideal. It's not the best way of enforcing MFA because MFA is happening at the wrong time. We're focused on making sure that MFA happens when it needs to happen, not when it doesn't need to happen. That's really the key message that we want you to take home today. We want you to understand why MFA is happening when it needs to happen. So in this example, TrustBroker is handling the MFA when the user logs into System B because System B has got confidential data in it, and the user has access to that confidential data. So because the user has access to that data through various authorizations and roles, that's why the MFA is happening when that user logs on. So this is one of the big differences with our product. So TrustBroker can be used for browser-based applications like Fiori, and it can be used for thick client applications like SAP GUI, Analysis for Office, and other methods of connecting into SAP. And in all cases, the MFA is being triggered based on the right reasons. It's based on what the user has access to, what they're doing. And when we actually start to introduce the SecurityBridge platform product into the mix, it gets even more powerful because TrustBroker can actually talk to SecurityBridge platform, and it can ask SecurityBridge platform, should we do MFA for this user? So let's say, for example, this user is logging in from an IP address that they don't normally use. That could be quite genuine. It could be that the user's got a new laptop and they're just using a different address for that particular logon. So it could be a genuine change, in which case they would get an MFA prompt and they would have to log in using MFA before they actually get into the system. If, however, that user's credentials have been compromised and the person who compromised the credentials is trying to log in from a different device in the company or outside of the company, then that would actually be a good reason for doing MFA. So these are the kind of things that can happen when TrustBroker is talking to SecurityBridge platform, asking SecurityBridge whether MFA is required. If the user is doing something that they don't normally do as part of their job, we'll come on to this in a moment, but they could, for example, be running a transaction that is not normally used by them. That transactions are used by certain users based on their role. So a basis admin will be running certain transactions on a regular basis because that's what they need to do their job. If they run a transaction that is not normally used by a basis admin because they've got access to it, that would be suspicious. So that could actually trigger an MFA challenge. So this is... Yeah.
Yes, and just one point, and assuming Airbus Defence, so they have their national networks, which are very separate from the rest of the world. But even in this case, I understand that because SecurityBridge can indeed look at the behavior of people and the patterns of people, SecurityBridge can say that Ralph is becoming, in the last 24 hours, has done very sensitive activities and abnormal activities compared to what he does normally. And he took a SAP role, he took a super user role, and therefore we can challenge that maybe it's not Ralph, it's somebody else from ADS, from Airbus. So that can be external network stuff, but can be internal behaviors, of course.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you for that example. That's a very good example. So there are lots of examples of how the products can work together to add value, and we need to document a lot of these things a bit better, but we haven't actually done that yet. I'd love to have a PowerPoint slide for every single use case, because there are lots of different things that we can do with the combined products. But not everybody's got both products. When they have got both products, we like to make them aware of the benefits of having both products. And of course, SAP single sign-on product or SAP secure login service cannot do any of that. So it's actually generating a lot of interest in the market, and there are a lot of companies that we're talking to who have the SAP product, one of the SAP products, and they're interested in switching over to using TrustBroker because of these capabilities. Because it's all about the MFA at the end of the day if you're trying to protect your data. So just one thing I was going to say. Okay, let's talk about step-up authentication next. Step-up authentication is just another way of saying re-authenticate. So when you log into your workstation, you're authenticating. When you log into SAP, you're authenticating. You're authenticating when you log into SAP using single sign-on at the moment. That could be MFA based on what's happening, as we've discussed. So you could have an MFA challenge when you log into SAP, but it could be single sign-on. It could be both, depending on what's happening. The user experience could change according to the nature of what that user has been doing. As Jean-Francois just said, if the user has been doing things that are a little bit different to what they normally do, then that could actually cause an MFA challenge the next time they log in, just to check that they are who they say they are, and that it's not actually somebody else who has actually gained access to that user's credentials. So authentication is important, obviously, and authentication is normally stopping when you log into your application. What we're doing is we're actually taking it a step further and saying that once you're in the application, in other words, once you're logged into SAP, we can actually re-authenticate the user based on risk. So it's much more targeted. We're targeting the MFA at the place where it needs to be. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's all about when the MFA should happen, and it should happen when it needs to happen. So we're doing a very much more targeted approach to implementing MFA in an SAP system. And again, SAP's products can't do this. You can't do this with SAML. So, sorry, did you have something to say?
Yeah, and that can also, Ralph, come back to the discussion we had a few 1 year ago or 6 months ago, but even checking whether the user, where the user is geolocalized, whether he's now working in this warehouse or is not in the warehouse. So other topics which SAP cannot handle naturally, which we could use as attributes. Of course, we need to fetch those attributes somewhere. But that's also the conditional parts, which is very important in your industry, Alf, of course. That can replace part of the discussion we used to have with Nexapps a few months ago.
Yeah, that's something that the product might need to be updated to support, but we're willing to do that. We obviously want to enhance the product according to customer needs, and if that's something that is of interest, then we can look a little bit more closely at that. One of the things that comes up quite often when we're discussing the product with people is they say, can we use MFA for people coming in from outside the company? And the reason why they're saying that is because they're used to the old perimeter network security approach, where you have firewalls around your company and you have perimeter, and you do the MFA when you come in from the outside. We try to discourage that because that's not really zero trust friendly, and perimeter security is something that is a bit more difficult these days because the perimeter is hard to define, especially when you're logging in from to applications that are hosted on the internet, in Rise or whatever. The perimeter is not always a very clear perimeter, and also, perhaps more importantly, the risk and the threat is about insiders. A lot of these attacks that happen, the real ones, are actually insiders involved. As I gave an example earlier, people on the dark web are selling credentials. So insiders in the company are giving credentials away to people who want to break into the systems. So it's all about insider attacks. It's not about somebody coming in through a VPN and needing to use MFA at the VPN. But the old way of protecting systems was to just put protection at the perimeter. That's not the good way of doing it these days. It has to be protected at the endpoint and the endpoint is the application where your data is. So step-up authentication is about re-authenticating to make it more targeted. So this is what it looks like in our product. So now we've extended the diagram to have the MFA happening inside the SAP system. So a user logs on to their workstation, they log into SAP, gets the single sign-on, and then they get the MFA when they do something after they've logged in. So that's, again, part of our product. So it all comes included. So you can choose where you want the MFA to happen. You can use this method of implementing MFA so that when somebody does something after they've logged in, that could trigger an MFA challenge. You could do it during the login if you wanted to. You could do both. It's quite interesting. I was presenting to another one of the SecurityBridge customers yesterday, and they explained to us that they actually have a number of different requirements where they have some systems that they have. I think they said they were in the Treasury department, and they wanted those systems to have MFA during the login for every single user. So every single user logging into the Treasury systems should have MFA. Doesn't matter what roles they've got. And then they had another system where they wanted single sign-on to log into the system, but they wanted MFA when the user actually runs sensitive or confidential administrative transactions. That was the word they used. So transactions that are used by administrators. And that's something that SecurityBridge can help with, because TrustBroker can call out to SecurityBridge and say, this user is running this transaction, and SecurityBridge will say, yeah, that's a transaction that's going to need MFA. It will come back to TrustBroker. TrustBroker will enforce the MFA. And if that MFA is successful, then the transaction will get executed. I will show this in my demo. So
okay, but would also mean that for any declared transaction, MFA would then be required. So this would mean if the admin is in and let's say is required to execute 2, 3, 4, 5 transactions in a row, then he always need to do the MFA.
If you want to do it that, yes, but you've also got the option of specifying a time limit. So if somebody has 5 transactions that they run within half an hour, and you set the time limit to half an hour, they'll only have to do MFA every half an hour. So if they run,
more flexible.
It makes the experience better for the user.
Just to avoid that we are then blamed.
I mean, we are aware that sometimes users see MFA as a negative thing because they're doing it too often, and they get annoyed with it, and it's almost like going back to having single sign-on. So I'm actually going to change something for a moment. Let me just log in. Because you're using Ping ID, I want to change our system so that it uses Ping ID rather than Microsoft MFA, so that you can just see how that looks. So in order to do MFA during the login, I'll show that first, and then we'll do the step-up authentication in the next part of the demo. There is a policy that sits on the SAP server, on the application server, that tells TrustBroker what to do. So this is the rule that I have at the moment. So I'm going to change that to Ping ID. And we have a Ping ID rule here. This is one rule. You could have multiple rules, but this rule is basically checking the role of the user. So if the user who's logging in has this role assigned, and they don't have any existing sessions, in other words, they're not already logged into the system, because that's another case where the user might get annoyed. If they're using create a new session /n/o, and they're creating multiple sessions, as a lot of administrators do, it would be annoying for the user if they had to do MFA for every single session. So we're checking if they've got an existing session. If they don't, and they've got the role, then we are basically doing an MFA challenge with Ping ID. This is actually where we specify the time. I said that we could have MFA every half an hour. This is where we're specifying that time in the policy. So I've set it to 3 minutes. Let me just, while I'm in here, I'll just show you something. So if you wanted to call out to SecurityBridge, so let SecurityBridge decide if MFA is required, you could do this. You get rid of all these things. Basically, you just say SecurityBridge equals true, which means TrustBroker calls out to SecurityBridge, and you could still have an auth time in there to specify how often the MFA happens, regardless of what SecurityBridge says, or you can remove that completely. And you could just tell it that you want to use the identity as the email address for Ping ID, and then call out to Ping ID. So very simple policy, just says hand over to SecurityBridge, let SecurityBridge decide. But you can also combine. You can actually do some of the checking inside Trust Broker and some of the checking inside SecurityBridge, or you can make it all inside Trust Broker, whatever you want, whatever's appropriate. So I'm going to just show you what it looks like with this rule where we're checking the role of the user, we're checking if they don't have an existing session, and we're going to use ping ID. Nice and simple. If I now log into this system, I am going to get an MFA challenge from ping ID, and it's using number matching. So on the ping ID app on my phone, which I've just got a notification from, I'm replying to the notification. It says to authenticate, select the number displayed on your screen. So it's giving me 3 numbers and I have to click on the right one. It's basically checking that I am actually in possession of the phone and also the same person in front of the screen. So I click on 19. Now it uses my fingerprint. I've clicked my finger on the fingerprint. It says authenticated, and now I'm logged in. So this is a case of I'm logging in and I'm getting an MFA challenge, and I'm getting that because of the fact that I had that role assigned and because I didn't have an existing session. So if I log in again to the same system, obviously I get this screen because I've already got a session, but I'm not getting an MFA because I'm already in. So existing session checking is quite important. We've also got the time interval as well, as I said. So if I logged off this system and I have no sessions, when I log in again, as long as it's within that, I think it was 3 minutes, then I'm not going to get an MFA challenge. So we have many, many customers all over the world using this capability. They really love it. It's nice and easy to use. It's targeted because you're triggering the MFA based on what the user has access to, but mainly their role. Or if you've got SecurityBridge, you can do a lot more because SecurityBridge has a lot more knowledge of user behavior inside SAP, and it can make a more informed decision about whether MFA is required. Similarly, when transactions are run, if we look at step-up authentication, I can run SE16, and SE16 has been effectively, at the moment, it's been hard-coded to use MFA. So I'm going to get an MFA challenge, and it's showing me the number. So on my phone, I'm going to enter the number. This is Microsoft, by the way. I haven't reconfigured it to use ping ID. Hopefully you can understand that it would work with ping ID, except you get a ping ID logo instead of a Microsoft logo. Pretty much the same. So I've run the transaction and I successfully authenticated. If that MFA didn't succeed, then the transaction execution would abort. It wouldn't actually be able to run the transaction. Now we've tested this, and we use it for transaction execution in many different ways, because as you probably know, transactions can be executed not just by the GUI, they can be run through SAP Business Client, they can be run through Web GUI, lots of different ways of running transactions. So all the different methods of running a transaction can be intercepted, and MFA can be enforced when those transactions are run. Another form of step-up authentication is when we actually go inside a transaction. So I'm going to look at my user ID inside SU01, and I can see my details. But if I go to the roles tab to look at my roles, then it could actually trigger an MFA challenge, because I'm actually looking at my roles, which are things I want to protect. I don't want anybody to see what roles I've got. So I enter the number on my phone, use my fingerprint, and because that was successful, I can now see my roles. So within a transaction, if you've got data that you want to protect for your business, you can put an MFA challenge on that. And that's...
So one question, Tim, and sorry, Ralph, I'm discovering still the company, please. The solution. So sorry for the question. So that it means if Airbus wants to protect indeed access to material, particular specific material, which is a military or national sensitive data, then you can protect based on the content, this type of content?
Yes, that should be possible. Yes, I mean it depends how the program that's, because okay. I'm just running a standard SAP transaction, which is displaying user details. It depends where that field is. I assume it's going to be within a DINPro screen like this.
And same question for the finance transaction you were referring. If somebody is trying to pay more, launch a payment of more than 1 million euros, above 1 million, boom, we want to block to check if the person is really the CFO, or if it is not Ralph or an admin. Is it possible based on this content?
It should be possible, and I can't categorically say yes or no, because there are some fields that are in applications in certain transactions that we can't trigger on. I don't know why. I don't know why. It's just that there are some transactions where there are fields, and for some reason, the way that our product works is not able to detect that field's been changed. So the best way is to try it out. I don't know for that particular use case. If Ralph would like to, we could do a proof of concept with Airbus, and we can try it out. We can help you configure it, and we can see whether it works or not. But theoretically, it's possible, but we don't know for sure.
Okay. Will be interesting, especially about custom fields or even custom transactions, where we have such specifics, especially in our AirPower environment, where we have a highly customized system, which is also being migrated, let's say, starting by end of this year. But nevertheless, it will be more 1-1 migration. But here we really have also sensitive data where on the one hand side, we would like to use ABAC for access control, but could also be interesting to have another multi-factor, let's say, on top of it, or even we just use it for the system access itself, and then protecting, let's say, or checking, as you have shown, the more critical roles like system admins, user role admins, something like this, or even IT support.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, definitely. I'll show you actually, one of our customers actually told us what transactions they decided to use. This is the screen.
And talking about what, talking about what just Ralph said, if they have some custom tables with very sensitive data, so they've created a custom table with very sensitive, the access, whenever a user is accessing this custom table, can we challenge MFA just on this?
I don't know. Sorry. To be honest, we don't know. The reason why it's not yes or no is because the way our product works is we intercept these programs and fields using a capability provided by SAP, and that capability provided by SAP wasn't designed for MFA. It was actually designed for logging. It's called RAL, Read Access Logging.
Yeah.
So if RAL has a capability to write a log record when somebody does something, then I can say that if that is possible, then Trust Broker can do the MFA when somebody does something.
Okay.
But RAL is not Trust Broker. RAL is not part of Trust Broker. It's part of SAP. And so all these different examples where people access tables, custom fields, etc. I don't know the answer because it depends how the application has been coded and whether that field is supported by RAL.
Okay.
That's a sort of more technical answer, but that's why I'm being vague.
But I'm not a developer, but I think that also with custom tables, it is possible to put some authorization objects on it. Is this also something where, let's say, you could step in then?
I don't know. It's the same answer. We don't know because RAL would need to be able to detect that is being done. Trust Broker is triggering when RAL is writing a log record, and that's it. So. And I'm not an expert in RAL. I didn't write RAL. It's written by SAP, and RAL has lots of hooks all over the SAP applications where it triggers a log record, or can trigger a log record if configured to do so, on things that happen within fields. So when a field is changed, it can actually trigger an MFA challenge. Actually, I think it might still work, but I've got a little example application here. This is actually a WebDimper application, which hopefully still works. Yeah, it's actually a game. So this is a WebDimper application called Othello. So I basically start this and I can play the game with SAP. So I just have to click on tiles and I actually try and cover the board in red circles. I've configured this to call Trust Broker when the field is changed. This field here, to change the size of the board to 5. So if I change the size of the board to 8, it changes it. If I change it to 5, 5 is the magic number, and I click New Game, then it's going to require MFA. So on my phone now, I have got a message to say I need to approve a sign-in. I'm using my approve button on my Authenticator app, and I'm using my fingerprint. And because I was successfully authenticating on my phone, it's now changed the board to a size 5. So that's an example of where we're triggering an MFA based on a field value. Obviously, you don't have to say if field value equals 5. You could actually say if field value is greater than X.
Yeah. Okay, interesting.
So that's just an example of something we can do. So even within a game, we can trigger based on that field, but that doesn't mean to say that every single transaction or program on the system can actually be triggered when a field is changed, because it depends how the program's been coded. There's a good chance, but the only way to find out is to try it. This is a list of transactions that one of our customer uses for MFA. They chose all these transactions and said these are where we want to do the MFA, and they've been using the product now for about 3 years, and that's what they chose.
Oh, and here you have select statements. So typically SQL select. I mean, typically data selection. So that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is important. And also, can you spend 2 minutes at some time, Tim, showing the policy? Because Ralph was mentioning ABAC, which is attribute-based access control, or also called policy-based access control. And I know that you can show how the policy's design or management looks like, if you have time.
I'm not sure what you mean, but I mean,
I think I remember seeing a demo where you showed the policy, how you design a policy, saying if the user is doing this and this and this, then we trigger an MFA. How you show
So with transaction authentication, we basically have a policy that says if the user runs these transactions, then use MFA, or we configure it to say call SecurityBridge and let SecurityBridge decide. I showed you that policy on the OS level. This one that it's not there. Here, I showed you the policy here. This was a policy. This is the policy that's used during the login for SAP GUI. For transaction authentication, the policy is stored somewhere else. So if I log into the system, so I'm already logged in. Let me just log in again. If I log in here, then this is the policy that's used for the transaction authentication. Let me just try and find the lines that are relevant. So transaction enable, transaction, the entries are all in a funny order. Here we go. So currently it says transaction enable, which means turn this feature on. Then we've got transaction/rules, which says use the rule called AZMFA. Obviously, I could switch it to using the ping ID. Let's assume that said ping ID, continue, because you're using ping ID. So these ping ID parameters here, and here would basically say use auth method ping ID, have an authentication time of 3 minutes, which means only do MFA every 3 minutes. Remember we talked about that earlier, to avoid having too much MFA. And we want to do MFA when transaction SNC4 is run. So that's the only transaction. Obviously, in practice, you'd have lots of transactions, or you could actually not have anything configured in here, and you could say SecurityBridge equals true, and it would ask SecurityBridge whether MFA should be required, and SecurityBridge will decide whether the transaction needs MFA rather than it being configured in here. So it's
based on what SecurityBridge would decide if MFA would be used or required for a certain transaction. Is it then more randomly?
SecurityBridge can be configured with an MFA policy that can be based on lots of things. I think I've actually got a screen image somewhere which shows what it looks like in. Yeah, here you go. No, that's not it. Wrong place. Here we go. So SecurityBridge platform MFA policy. So in version 7.05. So you'd have to be using the non-stable version of SecurityBridge platform to get 7.05, or you can wait for a few months until that's included. You can specify which SAP systems you want it to apply to, because you might only want to trigger MFA on certain systems if you want to do that. You can put a specific username in the policy. You can use patterns, so you can say I only want to do the MFA if the username begins with X or whatever. You can say, I want to do MFA if the user has super rights or elevated access. I want to do it based on a certain role or a profile. Does the user have critical authorizations such as SAP all? Or has the user logged in for the last X days, like 90 days? Because you might want to say, only want to do MFA if the user's not logged into this system for a long time, because then we don't necessarily trust that it's the same person, because it might have been somebody who's left the company. And then in addition to that, in 7.06, we are adding these when using a workstation not previously associated with the user. So in other words, a different workstation's used. Is the user suspicious? User is assigned to a specific business function. when the user logs in outside of their standard working hours, user assigned to a specific user group. So these are all the things that we're currently having there, and I believe there are a long list of other conditions that are being added in subsequent releases throughout the rest of this year. So this is just
like what we discussed with Tim recently, like citizenship, for example. Whenever you can find the attribute somewhere in one of your table, of course, Ralph, there is no magic. Or it can be geolocation for the same with the same condition that you have to know where how to find the attribute about geolocation, etc. This is the new things coming since the acquisition last year, which are policy based, coming to the topic that we used to discuss together, Ralph.
Yeah, so the nice thing about this is that if you're using SecurityBridge to decide on whether MFA is required using these configurable policies, one of the things that's quite nice about that is that you don't need to upgrade TrustBroker, because TrustBroker is typically deployed across your SAP systems, and it's used for people on a regular basis to log into their systems. And upgrading it means you could potentially affect the users, because you've got to sometimes, and depending on what you're doing, you could have downtime. You don't want to do that. So TrustBroker can be installed on your SAP systems, and you can then just upgrade SecurityBridge to add more capabilities as new MFA policy conditions become available.
Yeah. Just looking at the time.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything, Tim?
I will just quickly show something else. Let me show you what it can do with Fiori. So if I log into Fiori, for example, I'm just going to get an MFA challenge. Again, this could be Ping ID, not Microsoft, but don't have time to change it. But I'm having to approve my authentication, enter 16, and use my fingerprint, and I'm in. Now, one of the things that we are going to do in the roadmap is to make it so that you can trigger MFA when a tile is clicked. Now, that is a little bit like logging into SAP GUI and running transactions, but it's at the tile level. So different tiles could actually have an MFA policy behind them based on what they're actually doing. That's something that we don't do at the moment, but we really want to do that, and that's something that's coming in the future.
Okay.
But what I wanted to say is, you're currently using SAML, as a lot of companies do. SAML's great, and it does the job, but as I've pointed out, the way that the SAML protocol works is based on that architecture of MFA on an SSO architecture. So let me go back to that slide that I showed. This diagram here, this is how SAML is working. So you do your SAML authentication when you log into your first system. If you then log into another system that's got all the confidential data in it, you're not going to get an MFA challenge, because as far as SAML is concerned, you have a SAML token that's been issued, you've got a cookie in a browser, and you're just going to get authenticated using that credential. TrustBroker doesn't work that way. TrustBroker can actually be, because it's running inside each SAP system, it can actually decide whether MFA is required based on policies and based on how you want it to work. You could actually have one of your systems where all of your confidential data is, could actually be triggering an MFA challenge every time somebody logs in, because that makes sense to you. You can't do that with SAML. So these are some of the reasons why companies that we sell our product to actually buy our product also for the browser authentication and use it instead of SAML. We've actually got a significant number of customers that have done that because they've recognized the difference.
Very interesting. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah.
Just to wrap up, what is your feedback, Ralph?
Quite a lot of information, but also interesting information. And meanwhile, I also had some chats with Steve and so on. And it really looks interesting, definitely.